Noam Chomsky, internationally renowned MIT professor, practically invented modern linguistics. In addition to his pioneering work in that field, he has been a leading voice for peace and social justice. He's in huge demand as a public speaker all over the world. The New York Times calls him a global phenomenon, perhaps the most widely read voice on foreign policy on the planet. Author of scores of books, his latest is the bestseller, Imperial Ambitions. I talked with him in his office at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts in February 2006. Welcome to the program, Noam Chomsky.
Glad to be with you again.
I want to talk to you about Iran. Bush administration rhetoric on Iran echoes similar comments it made about Iraq. The president calls Iran the world's primary state sponsor of terrorism. The Secretary of State calls the country something to be loathed. The Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said the Iranian regime is today the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. And accompanying that, it's kind of reproduced in the media. Here's the February 13th cover story of Newsweek. The next nuclear threat. How dangerous is Iran? And there's a very grim photo of the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Where is U.S. policy going on Iran?
Well, U.S. policy has been fairly consistent with regard to Iran for over half a century. There's variations depending on circumstances, but the guiding principles are the same. So here people sort of pretend it's ancient history, but the people who hold the clubs typically like to forget history, say it's irrelevant. But the people who are hit by the clubs tend to remember history for good reasons, because it teaches you something. If we want to learn about it, we should be with the victims. They are the correct in this. Crucial, relevant parts of U.S. policy towards Iran begin, of course, with the overthrow of the parliamentary government in 1953 by a U.S., British-backed, initiated military coup, installed the Shah, one of the most brutal tyrants of the last half-century, supported him fully to the end. A couple of months before he was overthrown, President Carter was telling him how much the Iranian people love him because he's so marvelous and so on. He was overthrown in 1979. There were hostages taken at the time of the crisis. The only event that exists in American history is that hostages were taken, not 25 years of terror and torture after the overthrow of the government. But Iranians look at it differently. This is more history. Ever since that time, the United States has tried to destroy the government. They began by, right away, Carter sent a NATO general to try to instigate a military coup. U.S. had close relations with the Iranian military. And that didn't work. They started providing the Iranian military with arms. That's the way you overthrow a civilian government. You arm the military, providing them with arms via Israel with Saudi Arabian money, which makes sense because Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey were the allies in controlling Middle East oil. That didn't work. Then the U.S. supported Iraq's war against Iran. Iraq invaded Iran. Saddam Hussein is now on trial for crimes that he committed in 1982. If we had a free press in the country, they would be pointing out that 1982 was quite an important year in U.S.-Iraqi-Iranian relations. Now, that was the year in which Reagan took Iraq off the list of terrorist states supporting terror. And the reason was so that he could provide Iraq with aid, including means to develop weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, biotoxins, chemical weapons, and so on. At that time, it was primarily for the war against Iran, although the aid continued, the same aid, long after that war was over. There were other reasons. Donald Rumsfeld, who you quoted, was sent to Iraq to finalize the deal with their friend Saddam. Well, Iranians don't forget this. I mean, they lost a huge number of casualties to the U.S.-backed Iraqi aggression, the chemical weapons, other atrocities, and so on. And it continues until today. And the basic reason is simply that Iran disobeyed orders. Overthrowing a U.S.-installed tyrant is not acceptable behavior. And in one or another way, they have to be punished for it. The Iranian people have to be punished for it. So they've been under harsh sanctions, now threats of attack, not just threats, preparations for attack. So Israel is a small country, but it's more or less by now a U.S. offshore military base, so it has a very powerful military force. It has the most advanced and largest air force of larger than any, and technologically more advanced than any NATO power outside the U.S. And for the last couple of years, the U.S. has been sending over 100 advanced jet bombers to Israel, very publicly advertised as, capable of, hence with the intention of bombing Iran, equipped with what are called special weapons in the Hebrew press. No one knows what that means, but it's for the ears of Iranian intelligence. They're supposed to make a worst-case analysis. And the invasion of Iraq puts and Afghanistan puts U.S. forces surrounding Iran, the major nuclear power in the region. The only serious nuclear power in the region is Israel, hundreds of nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Iran is simply surrounded by hostile forces. The invasion of Iraq was a very clear signal, quite well understood everywhere, that if you want to deter a U.S. invasion, you have to have some kind of deterrent. Well, one deterrent is terror. Another deterrent is nuclear weapons. So it's basically a plea to Iran to develop nuclear weapons, and that's understood. One of Israel's leading military historians, Martin von Creveld, wrote, I think it was in the International Herald Tribune, that, of course, doesn't want Iran to get nuclear weapons, but he said if they're not doing it, they're crazy, given the strategic situation. Well, let's come closer to the present. 2 years ago, the European Union and Iran made a bargain. Iran is says they're enriching uranium for development of nuclear energy. If that's what they're doing, it's entirely within the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In fact, it's a little bit ironic at MIT, where we now are, I should say, because it must have been 1977, MIT made a deal with the Shah of Iran, pretty much to sell him the nuclear engineering department. The deal was that MIT would train lots of Iranian nuclear engineers, and in return the Shah would pay some big sum of money. That leak led to a huge protest on campus by students who were overwhelmingly opposed to it. The faculty equally overwhelmingly approved it. All of this is done, if not at U.S. government initiative, certainly with their support. At that time, Henry Kissinger was explaining that Iran needs nuclear energy. It has to preserve its petrochemicals for other purposes. Now, Henry Kissinger, he's just a symbol, same with everyone, is saying, no, they can't possibly need nuclear energy. They have so much petroleum gas reserves, so they must be developing nuclear weapons. It's the same programs. In fact, Kissinger was asked about this, and he said, well, then they were an ally. So then they needed nuclear energy. Now they broke out of our control, so they don't need nuclear energy. Well, are they developing enrichment of uranium, which is legal under the NPT, is not a long step from developing nuclear weapons. So, who knows? Maybe von Creveld is correct, and they're not crazy, but we don't know. Anyway, 2 years ago, the European Union did make a bargain with them that Iran would stop enriching uranium, though they're legally entitled to do it. And in return, here's the other half of the bargain, the European Union would provide firm guarantees on security issues. Now, the phrase security issues refers to U.S.-Israeli threats to bomb Iran. which are very serious. And by U.S. standards, Iran ought to be carrying out terrorist acts in the United States. In fact, we ought to be demanding that they do it. They're under far greater threat than anything Bush or Blair ever conjured up. And that's supposed to authorize what they call anticipatory self-defense, namely attack. Well, they can't bomb the United States, but they could do something else. Of course, that's totally outrageous, but that just tells you something about U.S.-British standards. However, Europe did not live up to its half of the bargain. Under U.S. pressure, it backed off. It did not make any offer to provide any guarantees of security. After a couple of years, Iran backed off from its side of the bargain. That brings us up to the present, with Europe refusing to live up to the bargain, the U.S. and Israel continuing, extending, in fact, the threats to security, which are serious. And Iran, we don't know. Maybe they're probably back to enriching uranium, and we don't know what purposes. I mean, if there were any interest, certainly no one wants Iran to get nuclear weapons. If there were any interest in preventing that, what would happen is you would reduce the threats, which are making it likely that they'll develop them as deterrent, and implement the bargain that was made, and then move towards integrating Iran into the general international economic system, or remove the sanctions, which are against the people, not the government, and just bring them into the world system. The U.S. refuses. Europe is so cowardly that they do what the U.S. orders them to do. One of the problems that the U.S. is facing is that China is not intimidated. That's why the U.S. is so frightened of China. You see headlines and front pages, how dangerous is China? Well, the primary danger of all the major powers, nuclear powers, China has been the most restrained in its development of offensive weaponry actions and so on. But China is frightening because it is not intimidated. Europe will back off and China won't. So European companies, frightened of the United States, have backed away from investments in Iran, but China just proceeds. That's why the U.S. is so terrified of China. If you're the mafia don and somebody doesn't pay protection money, that's scary, especially when you can't do anything about it. And what may happen, I mean, the Bush administration may succeed in driving Iran into the Asian energy security system. Iran has options. I mean, they might decide that Europe will never is much too cowardly to stand up to the United States, and decide, well, okay, they'll break their ties with the West and turn eastward. There is an Asian energy security grid. It's based in China and Russia. India will probably join. It's unclear. South Korea will probably join. They want to develop an independent energy security system for this rapidly growing industrial region in Asia. That's a very frightening prospect for the U.S. because it reduces global domination. If Iran joins it, it could be a kind of a linchpin. It has plenty of natural gas, substantial petroleum, and so on. And the U.S. may drive them into that grid, which would strengthen it, and that's expanding. China, as I say, is not intimidated. They're also making deals with Saudi Arabia, which is the main center of energy production. I've forgotten the exact number, but I think they're getting about maybe 10, 15% of their oil or some number like that from Saudi Arabia. They're also entering into military relations, both with Iran and Saudi Arabia. With Iran, it's presumably because the two countries regard it as a deterrent to U.S. Threats. With Saudi Arabia, it's extremely frightening to U.S. planners. The U.S. military catastrophe in Iraq, which is one of the worst in history, nobody anticipated it, may end up leaving Iraq with a Shiite majority, which has had pretty close relations with Iran, Shiite Iran. A lot of the clerics, including the Ayatollah Sistani, come from Iran. The major militia in the south, Badr Brigade, was trained in Iran, actually fought with Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. These ties have already been increasing. Muqtada Sadr, the other major militia, and the U.S. has turned him from a minor, unknown cleric into a major figure in Iraq by attacking him and so on. In fact, he gained, I think, 50% or so in the last parliamentary elections, and is now on a par with the other major Shiite bloc. He may end up being the leading element in the Shiite bloc. He was in Tehran recently and announced that if the U.S. or Israel attacks Iran, his militia and the U.S. is afraid maybe the Iraqi army will join in attacking the U.S. in Iraq. That could blow up. It's one of the deterrents. We don't know. Nobody knows. The Pentagon doesn't know. But it could end up, with the ultimate nightmare for Washington, Shiite bloc, including Iran, Iraq to the extent that it gains any sovereignty, and the Shiite areas of Saudi Arabia, which are adjacent to the two, which happen to be where most of Saudi Arabian oil is. That could be conceivably an independent, loose Shiite alliance controlling most of the world's oil, not subordinated to the United States, possibly even joining the Asian energy security grid. Well, if the Bush administration achieves that, they will have seriously undermined the U.S. position in the world, actually moving elsewhere. They're doing the same thing in Western Hemisphere. They have now, their talent for alienating allies is phenomenal. They've even succeeded in alienating Canada, and that takes tremendous talent. But the Bush administration has refused to follow NAFTA judgments in favor of Canada in cases, Canada-U.S. cases. The U.S. just told them to get lost, of course, after they ruled against the United States. And Canada's not very happy about it. They don't stand up to the United States, but they didn't like it. The government has said that, well, if this continues, we'll divert oil that we're sending to the United States to China. Canada's one of the major energy providers to the United States. The other major provider in the Western Hemisphere is Venezuela. Well, U.S. hostility to Venezuela has driven them to also to diversify. They've increasing relations with China, which is quite happy to do it. They're diversifying their exports. And from Venezuela down to Argentina, the region is almost out of control. The U.S. doesn't have the mechanisms it used to have, like military coups and attacks and so on. It can't do that anymore. In fact, they tried. In 2002, they did try to support a military coup in Venezuela to overthrow the government. That's the standard technique. But they had to back off very quickly because of a huge uproar in Latin America where democracy is taken more seriously than in Washington. And they had to back away and turn to subversion. They are also losing the economic controls. The main economic stranglehold for Latin America has been the offshoots of the Treasury Department, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, basically. It's part of the Treasury Department. And they have led Latin America into complete economic disaster almost everywhere. And they are now being kicked out. Argentina, which was the poster child for the IMF, had a terrible economic collapse following IMF rules. They managed to recover, but only by radically violating the rules. They are now, as the president says, ridding themselves of the IMF, paying off the debt, no more contact with the IMF. They're being helped by Venezuela, which brought up part of their debt. Bolivia will probably do the same IMF, World Bank catastrophe for the last 25 years. And if the U.S. loses its economic stranglehold over Latin America and can no longer carry out military attacks, which is not so obvious, incidentally, the U.S. is considerably increasing its military forces in Latin America. But if those controls are gone, it may not have any, in fact, almost certainly won't have anything like the degree of control it's had before. That includes major resource producers, oil in particular. Venezuela and Canada isn't going to drift very far, but even if they do it a little bit, if you add that to what they might do in the Middle East, it's going to change world affairs considerably. If the Asian energy security grid expands, and if an even worse nightmare for Washington, it includes Iran as a sort of a linchpin, possibly even Shiite Iraq and Saudi Arabia, then next they're going to diversify their financial reserves. They're held in dollars. That's part of what's propping up the U.S. economy. If they diversify, which is going to come sooner or later, I mean, they have enormous financial reserves, the biggest in the world. If they diversify to other currencies, that's going to be a major blow to the international financial system. Nobody knows what would happen, but it would be significant. Yes, all of the threats against Iran, which are very serious and criminal, in fact, literally.
Why do you say that?
Just take a look at the UN Charter. The threat of force is ruled out. Threat or use of force, but the threat alone is ruled out. And we accept that. For example, if somebody threatened us with, it is official U.S.-British policy that if there is any threat of force against the U.S. and Britain, they threat, not act, they can carry out anticipatory self-defense. They can attack the country. That's what happened in Iraq. In fact, France just went along with that. President Chirac, a couple of weeks ago, said that if any country threatens France with weapons of mass destruction, France is free to attack it. In fact, what he said literally is any country, he said, that is considering the use of weapons of mass destruction is subject to attack by France. Commentators were polite enough not to point out that what he was saying is that the French Air Force ought to be dropping nuclear bombs on Paris because, as he announced, France is considering the use of weapons of mass destruction, therefore should be a target of attack by French nuclear forces. Well, we'll put aside his little logical lapse. But that's an expansion of the British corollary to the British U.S. position. And yes, it's a typical imperial mentality. No one can consider the use of force against us, certainly not threaten it, obviously not prepare for it. That would be outlandish, but we can do it against them. In fact, that's considered very righteous. Well, the people at the other end of the club don't necessarily see it that way.
James Traub, writing in the New York Times magazine about these issues, says, of course, treaties and norms don't restrain the outlaws. The prohibition on territorial aggression enshrined in the UN Charter didn't faze Saddam Hussein when he decided to forcibly annex Kuwait. And then he adds, when it comes to military force, the United States can and will act alone. But diplomacy depends on a united front.
Well, as Traub knows very well, the United States is a leading outlaw state, totally unconstrained by international law, says so. Just invaded Iraq, even though that's in radical violation of the UN Charter.
Well, if he knows that, why doesn't he write it in the article?
If he wrote it in the article, he wouldn't be writing in the New York Times. I mean, there's certain discipline that you have to meet. Kind of a well-run society, you don't say things you know. You say things that are required for service to power. We can go back. I mean, after all, the United States, speaking of outlaw states, the United States is the only state in the world to have rejected a World Court decision. It used to have some company, Albania and Libya, but they've now accepted them. So the U.S. now stands alone in rejecting World Court decision on the matter of international terrorism, or if we want to be literal, aggression.
That was the case of Nicaragua in 1986.
It's not usually noticed that technically U.S. actions against Nicaragua fall under the definition of aggression, the one that was given by Chief Counsel Robert Jackson at Nuremberg defined aggression. Take a look at the wording. Explicitly includes what the U.S. was doing against Nicaragua. In fact, what it's doing against Cuba. But certainly the invasion of Iraq, it's not even a question. Furthermore, we can run through the list, but it's hard to find any state that compares with the U.S. as an outlaw state, and it says so proudly. Anticipatory self-defense is a complete violation of the basic principles of international law. In fact, Condoleezza Rice has been pretty frank about it. She says the United States has found that international jurisdiction is not appropriate for the United States.
You sometimes tell the story of St. Augustine in the City of God, pirates and emperors involving the Emperor Alexander and his encounter with a pirate on the open seas. You tell that one?
Well, actually, the pirate, I don't know if it happened, but the story is that the pirate was brought to Alexander, and Alexander asked him, how dare you molest the seas with your piracy? And the pirate answered, according to the account, he said, how dare you molest the world? I have a small ship, so they call me a pirate. You have a great navy, so they call you an emperor. But you're molesting the world. I'm doing almost nothing by comparison. And yes, that's the way it works. The emperor is allowed to molest the world. The pirate is a major criminal. Again, the world doesn't see it that way.
18 Pakistani civilians were killed in a U.S. missile attack on Pakistan in early January 2006. The New York Times, in an editorial comment on that, said that those strikes were legitimately aimed at top fugitive leaders of al-Qaeda.
That's because the New York Times agrees, and always has, that the U.S. should be an outlaw state. Yeah, that's not surprising. You read the same thing in the Iraqi press, I suppose. Yes, the U.S. should be an outlaw state. It has the right to use violence where it chooses, no matter what happens. If you hit the wrong people, we'll say, oh, sorry, we hit the wrong people. But yes, there should be no limits on the right of the United States to use force.
But the New York Times and other such liberal outlets have been quite vigilant and vigorous in defending the law here in the United States. They're very exercised about surveillance and snooping and invasions of privacy that are going on. But that concern for law does not seem to extend to the international arena.
Well, no, that's not quite true. They're very concerned with, just like James Traub, with violations of international law when some enemy does it. So the policy is completely consistent. It should never be called a double standard. It's a single standard. You subordinate yourself to power. That's the single standard. Now, surveillance is bothersome to people in power. They don't like it. CEOs don't want to have their email read by the big brother. So, yeah, they're kind of annoyed with surveillance. On the other hand, gross violation of the international law, what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime that carries with it all the accumulated evil that follows, namely, for example, the invasion of Iraq. That's just fine. Actually, there's an interesting, important book, which naturally isn't reviewed, by two international law specialists, Howard Friel and Richard Falk.
The Record of the Paper.
Record of the Paper, which happens to focus on the New York Times, but only because of its importance. The rest of the press is the same. So they focus on the New York Times and its attitude toward international law. And they point out, yes, I think they cover about 40 years, the practice has been consistent. If an enemy can be accused of violating international law, huge outrage, much posturing, and so on. When the U.S. does it, it didn't happen. So they point out, just to take one example, that in the, 70 editorials and opinion pieces prior to the invasion of Iraq, the words UN Charter and international law never appeared. Yeah, that's typical of a journal that believes the U.S. should be an outlaw state. So you can't criticize them. They're very consistent. They're consistent in supporting the right of the powerful, who they are associated with, to carry out any crimes they want.
In a report in late January in the LA Times entitled 57% Back a Hit on Iran If Defiance Persists, it shows that support for military action against Iran has increased over the last year, even though public sentiment is running against the war in neighboring Iraq. Is that a paradox?
No, it's not a paradox. In fact, there are figures in polls that look like paradoxes. So, for example, take Iraq. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but a fairly large percentage, maybe 2/3 of the population, thinks it would have been wrong to invade Iraq if it had no weapons of mass destruction. In fact, even if it had an intention to do so, it would have been wrong to invade. That's some high number, let's say 2/3. On the other hand, about half thought it was right to invade Iraq, even though the fact that they had no weapons of mass destruction has been officially conceded long before, and the public knows it. Well, that looks like a direct contradiction. But the director of the institute that runs the polls, the Program on International Policy Attitudes, which is the major one, Stephen Cull, he pointed out it's not really a contradiction. People still believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, even though it's been officially conceded that they don't. What does that mean? Well, what it means, he didn't go into it, but what it means is that the government media propaganda campaign was extremely effective in instilling fears. People think they're defending themselves, even if it's already been conceded that the threat was not there and maybe concocted. They still fear, the fear still remains. And it's the same with Iran. You read enough of those articles you cited, you'll think we're in mortal danger if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. Actually, what danger are we in, even if Iran does get a nuclear weapon? I'm not going to use it except as a deterrent. I mean, if there was even an indication that they were planning to use it, the country would be, vaporized. So it's there for a deterrent. But people can be frightened by massive propaganda. That's not a surprise. I mean, let's say take a classic example, Germany. It was the most civilized country in the world, the lead in the sciences, the arts, in the Weimar Republic and so on. Within 2 or 3 years, it had been turned into a country of raving maniacs by extensive propaganda, which incidentally was borrowed from Anglo-American commercial propaganda, explicitly borrowed from it. And it worked. It frightened Germans. They thought they were defending themselves against the Jews, against the Bolsheviks, and therefore we know what happened next. Yeah, that can be done. And it was done to an extent in the United States as well, by very effective propaganda. And you're seeing it again today. So, for example, you might ask, just do a media search and find out how often it has even been mentioned that when Iran began enriching uranium again, it was after the Europeans had rejected their side of the bargain, namely to provide firm guarantees on security issues, which is no trivial matter. That means guarantees that Iran will not be attacked. Well, of course, when Europe backed down, they expect them to back down. Ask if that has been mentioned once in the media in the United States, anywhere. I mean, it's not that the press doesn't know it. Of course they know it, at least if they read the international business press, they know it. For example, there was a very good article about it in the London Financial Times a couple of weeks ago. It's the leading business paper in the world. They read it in the New York Times. It was by Zellick Harrison, who's one of the leading specialists on it. You think they didn't read that on the New York Times news desk or editorial board? Sure they read it, but that's not the kind of thing you report. I don't have the facilities to do a search, but I'd be willing to bet that that's never even been mentioned in the United States.
Tariq Ali talks about the unchallenged U.S. military might combined with this economic weakness, which you alluded to earlier, and that this could be a very dangerous and lead to a very dangerous and volatile situations where there would be more aggression and more war in order to mask the economic weakness. Is there anything to that?
It's possible. I mean, a dangerous predator, say, some lion on the march or whatever can be dangerous, but a wounded beast is much more dangerous. Then it may act in ways which are pretty unpredictable, and everyone knows that, and the same is true in international affairs. The Bush administration has turned the United States into a monstrous attack instrument, but a wounded one. And that's a very threatening state of affairs. In fact, the Bush administration is quite consciously increasing the threat of a nuclear attack against the United States, of nuclear terror. It's increasing the threat of general terrorism in many, many ways. And it's conscious. I mean, not because they want it, but because it just doesn't matter that much. It's a low priority. I mean, you can see that in cases. I mean, take, say, the invasion of Iraq. Perfectly well understood, and they learned it from their own intelligence agencies and others, that the attack was likely to increase proliferation of weapons of mass destruction for deterrence and to increase terror. And so it did. In fact, it did so in unanticipated ways. It was expected that it probably increased terror, as in fact it did. But what about weapons of mass destruction? I mean, you read that it was discovered by the official U.S. investigations, Dilfer and Kay reports, that Iraq didn't have means to develop weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's not exactly correct. It did. They were there. The ones that were provided to Saddam Hussein by Britain, the United States, and others, as long as he was obeying orders. They were being dismantled, but they were still there under guard by UN inspectors. The UN inspectors were kicked out. Rumsfeld, Cheney, and the rest didn't think it was interesting to tell their troops to guard the sites, so they were systematically looted. The inspectors continued their work by satellite, and they reported that over 100 sites had been systematically looted, meaning not just somebody goes in and steals something, but carefully and looted. And they described the equipment that was in them. It was high-precision machine tools and others that could be used to develop missiles and nuclear weapons. Dangerous biotoxins, lethal biotoxins could be used for biological weapons. All that went somewhere. That's expanding the threat of weapons of mass. We all hate to guess where it went, but you can make a guess. That's well beyond the threat to the United States that was anticipated from the invasion of Iraq. I met a Jordanian journalist who was part of a Swedish journalists association who informed me that he was at the Jordanian-Iraqi border through this period, and he said the border guards were reporting that he said 1 out of every 8 trucks that was coming from Iraq into Jordan under the U.S. occupation was testing positive for radioactive materials. Well, there's a name for this. In fact, Rumsfeld had a nice phrase for it. Stuff happens. Yeah, stuff happens. And it's not that they're trying to increase the threat to the United States. It's just it doesn't matter.
Can bewilder some people because these are intelligent, smart people educated at our best universities. Why would they construct and implement a policy that seems to be counterintuitive to their interests?
It's not. It's very good for their interests. It increases. They have 2 fundamental interests. You have to be willfully blind not to see it. It's a very simple administration policy. Policy 1 is stuff the pockets of your rich friends with as many dollars as possible. That's policy 1. Policy 2 is get into a position where you can shake your fist at the world and they'll do what you want them to do. Intimidate the world by force. Okay. It's achieving those aims. The invasion of Iraq achieved those aims. Nobody at Halliburton is complaining that they're going broke. In fact, the same companies that provided Iraq with the weapons are now being paid to what they call reconstruct Iraq, which means to rob the U.S. taxpayer blind. The amount of corruption and robbery under the occupation has just been colossal. But so they're making out fine, and furthermore, control. If the U.S., I think everyone assumed that this invasion would be a walkover. Iraq was completely defenseless. They knew it. They'd already been bombing it for a year. We now know that in detail.
Spikes of activity
Activity which they kept secret because Blair and Bush and the guys around them hate democracy so much that you must not allow the population to know what you're doing. But they were doing it, and we now know about it, some of it at least. So it looked completely defenseless. Should have been able to walk in and, it should have been the easiest military occupation in history. Okay, they managed to turn it into a catastrophe. But it looked as though they'd easily be able to control Iraq, which means gaining control of the second largest hydrocarbon reserves in the world, and significantly increasing their domination of Middle East oil production, which provides what Zbigniew Brzezinski put it well. He said that provides the United States with critical leverage over its major rivals, Europe and the Asian industrial system. And those are policies that go back to right after the Second World War. As George Kennan put it, controlling, we don't need Middle East oil, and we don't even want it, but controlling it gives the United States veto power over others. You have your hand on the spigot, you can determine what they'll do. We just saw an illustration of this when Russia turned off the spigot to the Ukraine, and Europe was facing an energy crisis. Nobody expects anyone to do that, but the poised fist is a very good instrument of control. So it's a rational policy. If it happens to be threatening to the American population, it's not a priority. That's not who they're working for. When they cut taxes for the rich, is that for the benefit of the population? If they read this morning's headlines, if they concealed the fact that the levees had broken in New Orleans for 2 days, is that in order to help the population? It's just not a priority. Other people, if you have to cut Medicaid for the poor, who cares about them? There's almost 40 million people going hungry. They don't have enough money to buy food. Does that matter? No. They're not going to vote. They're not influential, So who cares what happens to them?
But the owners of the economy, the managers of the state, they have children, they have grandchildren. Certainly in the areas you're describing of increasing military threats, they're putting their own lives and the lives of their families in peril. Again, it doesn't seem logical.
It seems, here you have to distinguish between people in their human existence and their institutional role. A corporate executive or an official in the Pentagon may be the nicest guy in the world, takes care of his children, plays with them, cares about them, and so on. But in the institutional role, he may act in such a way as to endanger their lives. So take, say, a corporate executive. After all, they have legal obligations. Their legal obligation is to maximize profit and market share, and they're not allowed to do anything else. It would, in fact, be a violation of corporate law. That's their legal obligation, part of the institutional role. And that goes across the board. Just go back to this case I mentioned to you right here at MIT back in the late 70s about providing Iran with means to develop nuclear energy. The students were overwhelmingly opposed. There was a referendum, a vote, I think it was about 80%. The faculty approved it by approximately 80%. Well, the faculty are just the students of a couple of years ago. So what happened in between? Did they get smarter or something? No, they shifted their institutional role. When you're students, you're relatively free. In fact, it's the freest time of your life. You're out of parental control, more or less. You don't have to worry about providing for a family. You're free to think and act. You're a faculty member. You're part of the institution. You support institutional priorities. And the same people who were students a couple of years before took exactly the opposite position from the students after they'd shifted the institutional role. That's very common. It doesn't mean that their personalities have changed. There's nothing to do with that. And that's why you find euphoria in business circles over the election of a president whose policies grossly oppose their own values. That's demonstrable. I mean, CEOs have what are called liberal values. You know, they don't have any objection to gay rights. They want abortion rights, so on and so on. These so-called cultural issues, they're kind of like college faculty. On the other hand, if you read the business press the day after the election, there was euphoria in boardrooms. Why? Because this government is going to give a free run to business. And if it turns out that that destroys the lives of our grandchildren, well, you know, it's not our institutional role to worry about that. I mean, as a person I may, but not when my task is to maximize power and profit.
In early February, the 35-nation Board of Governors of the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, voted to refer Iran to the UN Security Council over its nuclear program. There is a possibility of sanctions being imposed on Iran.
Well, there's not a possibility. The U.S. has had sanctions on Iran ever since they disobeyed orders.
Right, but in terms of UN-imposed sanctions a la Iraq.
I mean, they're called UN sanctions on Iraq, but that's just propaganda. I mean, they were U.S. sanctions administered through the UN because the UN is afraid to stand up to the United States. But everybody's paid attention, knows there was virtually no support for those sanctions outside the U.S. and Britain. And they're called UN sanctions because then it sounds as if somebody else is doing it. There were U.S. sanctions which were devastating the society. And if the UN, under the U.S. fist, passes some kind of sanctions, which frankly I think it's questionable, but if they do, it'll be U.S. sanctions again. You know anybody else in the world, aside from the U.S. and Britain, who are in favor of the sanctions? I mean, the Europeans aren't. They want to invest in Iran. They had to pull out, they didn't have to, they did pull out of, many of the corporations pulled out of investment, and they explained why. You can read it in the Wall Street Journal. They said, we just don't want to offend the United States. It's too dangerous. You know, I mean, international affairs is very much like the mafia, and you don't offend the Don. It's dangerous, especially if the Don's wounded, and you never know what he's going to do.
But Iran has a weapon to fight back with in terms of putting a choke on its oil supply, and that would have a potentially very deleterious effect on the global economy. It's the fourth largest producer of oil in the world.
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I mean, I'm not sitting in the cabinet Pentagon planners, but I think they would like that because that would give them an excuse to bomb Iran. In fact, it might even give them an excuse to invade. I mean, if you look at the geography, Iranian oil is concentrated in the Gulf area, which happens to be substantially Arab Shiite. And it's, you know, I'm no military expert, but I'm sure it's within the military capacity of the United States to occupy that area and to open up the Gulf. And if Iran tried to close it, they might very well do that. I mean, who knows what it would lead to? You know, maybe we'd blow Iraq up and blow the world up, but, you know, they don't, that's not a calculation, any more than they care that they are compelling Russia and China to sharply increase their offensive military forces aimed at the United States, to put their missiles on hair-trigger alert, which is, you know, strategic analysts just call it an accident waiting to happen. I mean, not leftists, incidentally. Senator Sam Nunn, you know, very serious and respectable conservative who's been in the lead in efforts to cut back on the threat of nuclear war. He warned recently we may be developing an Armageddon of our own making. Yeah, maybe, but if you're a planner, that just doesn't matter much. So yes, if Iran did try to choke off the Gulf, the Hormuz, the Pentagon planners might be delighted and take that as an excuse to prove that we have to not only bomb Iran, kill its people and so on, but also occupy its oil-producing areas. During the Iraq War, U.S. support for Iraq was so strong that the U.S. essentially patrolled the Gulf just in order to make Iran understand it. A U.S. destroyer shot down an Iranian airliner in Iranian commercial airspace, killing 290 people. Well, George Bush, the number one, who was then president, thought that was great. But Iranians may not have liked it.
Howard Zinn, in one of his essays, it's called The Problem is Civil Obedience. And he says, civil disobedience is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience of people behaving and taking orders and not questioning. Talk about that and talk about resistance.
Well, we don't have to undertake armed resistance. He's quite right. And in fact, the press that you were reading at the beginning is a perfect example of it. That's obedience to power and authority. The suppression of the critical facts about the potential confrontation with Iran is just obedience to authority. And we can run through such a long list, it's not worth going through it. Sure, he's right. It's obedience and subordination to power that's the major problem, not just here, but everywhere. It's much more important here because the state is so powerful. So it matters more here than in Luxembourg. But yes, it's the same problem. How do you confront it? Well, we have models as to how to confront it. First of all, we have plenty of them in our own history. We have them elsewhere in the hemisphere. For example, Bolivia, or Haiti even, had democratic elections of a kind that we can't even conceive of. Like take, say, Bolivia. Were the candidates both rich guys who went to Yale and joined Skull and Bones and can run with the same programs because they're supported by the same corporations? No, they elected someone from their own ranks. It's because democracy. Half happened in Haiti yesterday. Probably if Aristide had not been expelled from the Caribbean by the United States, it's very likely that he would have won the election. They act in ways which enable them to participate in the democratic system. Here, we don't. That's real obedience. And the kind of, if you like, disobedience that's needed is to recreate a functioning democracy. That's not a very radical idea.
Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, good to talk to you.